This iPad Pro was released back in May of 2021, making it almost 5 years old now. And yeah, time flies. What made this generation special was the fact that for the first time, Apple put an M series Mac chip, namely the M1, inside an iPad, and it kinda took the tech world by storm. Early benchmarks were showing insane performance gains over the 2020 iPad Pro, which was pretty bananas considering year-over-year gains are typically pretty modest. Fast forward to today, and you can actually find this 12.9-inch iPad Pro for quite a bit less than the price of a brand new iPad Air, which raises some pretty interesting questions that I'll get into in a second. I've had mine since about mid-2022, and yes, that was literally just a few months before the M2 models were announced, but I've been using it primarily for things like note-taking, consuming content, connecting it to my Mac as a secondary display, and some light research and web browsing. So after nearly 4 years of real-world use, does it still hold up? And if you don't already use an iPad, is it still worth buying used today? Or should you just save a little more for something newer like an M3 iPad Air, or even one of the insanely expensive M5 iPad Pro models? Let's get into it. Starting with the hardware, this design with the flat sides definitely still holds up even though it's nearly 8 years old, originally revealed in the 2018 iPad Pros. The build quality is excellent, it's thin, it's light, and on its own, it's super easy to throw in a bag and take around with you. Though once you add something like the Magic Keyboard, it starts to feel a bit more like carrying a small laptop, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, just something to be aware of depending on how you use it. This model was available in either silver or space gray, and mine here is the silver Wi-Fi and cellular version, which is why you'll notice the antenna bands along the top and bottom, as well as the millimeter wave cutouts. Overall, I still think it looks super clean, minimal and modern, and very Apple-like, even nearly 5 years later. And I know, not a lot of people really like the minimal aesthetic, which is totally fine, like what you like, but as for me, I am all for it. The one thing worth mentioning, if you're someone who uses an iPad without a case and tends to lay it flat on its back, the edge of the camera bump will probably pick up some scratches over time. It's purely cosmetic and doesn't affect functionality at all, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. The silver finish is much better at hiding that kind of wear compared to the space gray though, which is pretty nice. Button layout is exactly what it's always been on iPad. Power button on top and volume buttons on the side, so nothing surprising there. You also get a Thunderbolt 4 port, which means data transfer speeds are still plenty fast, and external accessories like SSDs, USB-C hubs, and monitors all work exactly as you'd expect, especially after iPadOS 16 introduced full external display support. Overall, this is just a really well-designed product, and even after years of use, there's really not much to complain about from a design or build standpoint, which I definitely appreciate. Now, the display was easily one of the standout features of this entire generation. The 12.9-inch model was the first Apple product with what I consider a true mini LED display. Yes, technically the Pro Display XDR also had local dimming before this iPad, but that has far fewer dimming zones, especially when you consider how much larger it is at 32 inches. This iPad Pro has something like 2,500 local dimming zones compared to the Pro Display's 570-ish, which was a significant improvement, especially for a screen that's less than half its size. Because of the mini LED backlight, this display can get pretty close to OLED-like black levels. That means when parts of the screen are supposed to be black, those local dimming zones can turn off entirely, which gives you true blacks and great contrast, especially for movies and any HDR content. But there is one pretty major trade-off. Mini LED doesn't turn off individual pixels like OLED does, and because of that, you get blooming. That's the halo or light bleeding effect you'll sometimes see when bright elements sit on a dark background. And this iPad is probably one of the worst offenders when it comes to blooming, especially in darker environments. You'll definitely notice it with white text on a black screen or UI elements floating around on dark backgrounds. I'll put some comparisons between this iPad, my MacBook, which also uses mini LED, and my phone, which has an OLED display, just so you can see clearly how they stack up side by side. But blooming aside, this display is still excellent. Colors look great and are consistently accurate, and sharpness is fantastic. It's a Retina display, as with pretty much all Apple displays, which basically means that at a normal viewing distance, you're not going to see individual pixels. And even when you lean in closer than you probably should, it still looks incredibly sharp. It also gets pretty bright. You're looking at around 1000 nits sustained, with peaks up to 1600 nits for HDR highlights, which still holds up great today. And of course you get 120Hz ProMotion, which makes everything feel so much smoother. So even with the blooming issues, this is still an amazing screen. And it's one of the reasons this iPad has aged pretty well. Performance is where things start to get a little complicated. Like I mentioned earlier, this was the first iPad to get an M series chip, specifically the M1. And at the time, that was kind of insane. This was the same M1 Apple had just unveiled and put into the MacBook Air, the 13-inch MacBook Pro, and the Mac Mini only about 6 months earlier. This was the chip that basically kickstarted Apple Silicon's desktop dominance and completely changed how we thought about performance and efficiency. And Apple just plopped it right into an iPad. So there is no question this was and still is a wildly powerful and efficient chip, especially for iPadOS. From a raw performance standpoint, the M1 has never really been a problem. But today, the experience doesn't feel quite as fast or as smooth as it did when I first got it. I think that mostly comes down to a combination of two things: battery aging and the increased complexity of iPadOS. This iPad has now been through 4 major versions of iPadOS, and as we all know, iPadOS 26 in particular was a bit of a big boy. It introduced liquid glass, much more capable multitasking, and in general, made the iPad feel a lot more Mac-like than ever before. Now on its own, that's not really an issue. The M1 can probably handle all that just fine. It is a Mac chip after all. Where I think things start to break down is the battery. This is a nearly 4-year-old iPad with a pretty much 4-year-old battery, and this is where it's probably worth briefly bringing up Batterygate. You might remember when Apple got accused of, and eventually sued for, slowing down older devices. While that whole situation was messy, the core idea behind it was actually very real, and still applies today. As batteries degrade over time, they simply can't deliver peak power as reliably as they used to. Modern operating systems, especially something as visually and computationally heavy as iPadOS 26, have pretty high power demands. To prevent unexpected shutdowns, the system will occasionally need to throttle performance. So Apple technically did slow down older devices slightly with new software updates, and still does, but the issue wasn't that they were doing it to force upgrades, though let's be real, they probably wouldn't mind that at all. The real problem was that they implemented those safeguards without really telling users what was happening. But anywho, I think that's what I'm running into here. Day to day, things like swiping between home screens, opening and switching between apps, or just navigating around the UI just stutter more than they used to. It's noticeably less smooth than it was on something like iPadOS 16, which was the version this iPad originally shipped with. Now just to be clear, this is not a deal breaker. It doesn't stop me from using the iPad, and it doesn't really make it frustrating or unreliable. It's just an observation, and it's something you should keep in mind if you're thinking about picking one of these up refurbished, because it's only going to get worse the older it gets. But in terms of actual capability, it still runs everything I care about without any real issues. It's still very much usable. It just won't feel as fast or as consistently smooth as something like the current generation iPad Pro or even a newer iPad Air. On to battery life, I'm not going to spend too much time here because we've already touched on most of what matters, but yeah, the battery life at this point is pretty rough. And that shouldn't really be a surprise. Like I said earlier, this is a nearly 4-year-old iPad with a nearly 4-year-old battery. There's only so much you can expect from a lithium battery after that long, especially in a device that's been regularly used. Standby time in particular is also not great anymore. I'll charge it up to 100%, use it for an hour or two, and watch it drop down to 60 or 70%, then set it down for a few hours and come back to it sitting closer to 40%. Now just like with performance, this isn't necessarily a deal breaker, especially if you're mostly using it at a desk or near a charger. But it is, again, something you need to keep in mind. If you're buying a device that's sold, you should absolutely expect worse battery life. There's just no way around that, and it's probably the biggest downside of picking up a 2021 iPad Pro today. Before getting into my recommendations, let's talk about accessories really quickly. I've been using both the Apple Pencil and the Magic Keyboard, and overall, they've been super solid, but they're definitely not equal in terms of how essential they are. The Apple Pencil is, in my opinion, the essential iPad accessory. Even though I'm not in school anymore, at least for now, I still use it regularly. I take sermon notes at church and pretty much anything else that just works better with handwriting. It's the accessory that really separates an iPad from a laptop, but the Magic Keyboard, on the other hand, is a bit harder to recommend for most people, especially since there are so many other cheaper options that pretty much do the same thing. It is really nice. The typing experience is solid, the trackpad works well, and the whole floating design is still pretty sweet. But in my day-to-day use, I've just found that I don't reach for it very often. If I'm sitting down at a desk and actually want to get work done, I'll just use a Mac. Because of that, I really think the Magic Keyboard only makes sense if you genuinely intend for your iPad to be your main computing device. If you already own a laptop, especially a Mac, it starts to feel redundant and unnecessary pretty quickly. So at this point, everything we've talked about really just comes down to one question. Should you buy this 2021 iPad Pro refurbished? Or should you go for something newer like the M3 iPad Air, or even a current iPad Pro? Right now, this 12.9-inch iPad Pro goes for somewhere between $400 and $800 US refurbished, depending on condition and storage. And that probably doesn't include the cost of a battery replacement, which is about $120 directly from Apple. The 13-inch M3 iPad Air, on the other hand, is $800 brand new, although it does go on sale pretty often. As much as I still respect this iPad Pro, I think the iPad Air is probably the better buy for most people who are just getting into iPad for the first time, or are upgrading a really old iPad, even though it costs more. You're getting the M3 chip, which is a pretty meaningful step up from the M1, especially in graphics performance. It's going to feel faster and more consistent over time, and more importantly, it's going to continue to get software updates for longer before you start running into the same performance and battery related issues we talked about earlier. You also get some real quality of life improvements, the biggest one being the webcam finally moving to the side, which makes video calls feel much more natural. Of course, there are some trade-offs though. The iPad Air does use a standard LCD for its display at 60Hz, while the iPad Pro has a mini LED display with 120Hz ProMotion. And even to this day, that Pro display still looks better. You also lose Face ID in favor of Touch ID on the top button, which really just comes down to personal preference. One other thing worth mentioning is Apple Pencil support. The M3 iPad Air only works with the Apple Pencil Pro. You can't use the older Apple Pencil like you can on the 2021 iPad Pro. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The Apple Pencil Pro does have some pretty nice upgrades, but it does mean buying a newer, more expensive accessory if you don't already have one. Outside those differences though, the overall experience between these two iPads is pretty much the same. Now that being said, if the display really is a deal breaker for you, like if you already know you're gonna miss ProMotion every single day, I actually still wouldn't recommend buying this older iPad Pro. At that point, I think you're still better off saving a bit more and going for something like an M5 iPad Pro, or even better, a refurbished M4 iPad Pro. Yes, they're substantially more expensive, and you should absolutely have a good reason before spending that kind of money, but they're also significantly better devices, especially if you plan on using your iPad as your primary computing device. And honestly, even if nothing else, the tandem OLED display alone is worth the price of entry. In my opinion, it's easily the best display on any Apple product, even better than the iPhone displays, which held that crown for a pretty long time. So almost 5 years later, the 2021 iPad Pro is still a pretty impressive piece of hardware. It aged fairly well because it was kind of overbuilt from the start, which isn't a bad thing. But time does catch up. Battery life, software complexity, and newer alternatives do matter, and today in 2026, that context is impossible to ignore. If you already own this iPad and it's still working for you, there's really no urgent reason to upgrade. If you're buying today though, I think newer hardware, even if it's technically less pro or more expensive, is probably the better long-term move. As always, it really just comes down to personal preference and what you value most. I hope this helped clear things up. Feel free to let me know what you think about the iPad and whether you agree that a newer iPad would probably be the better buy, but otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.